Okay, so we're going to start talking about chapter 4, which is voting and elections. And there are 4 parts to this particular lecture because it's kind of a long lecture. So I broke it down in different parts so it'll be easier to assimilate and easier to digest. So for this part, what we're going to be talking about is what defines a democracy. And your book does not really get into democracy and what represents a democracy. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. That's more like American government, but I'll give you a little bit about it in this one as well. We're going to be talking about voting rates and why people go out to vote. And later on, we'll talk about why people don't go out to vote. But there's some issues about in Texas. There's been a past in Texas of how voting behavior has been affected or how voting behavior has been shaped in Texas and some barriers that were put in place that had to be removed by numerous court cases. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what is a democracy. As I said, this book doesn't really talk a lot about it, but you have to know that we live in probably the greatest democracy in the world. And so what we have is we have a representative democracy or a republic. Now, being a republic or a representative democracy, what that means then is that we vote in our politicians. And we vote in our politicians so that they will represent our views or that we think that whoever we vote in are going to be do the best for the country. There's different ways that you can look at it, but we're not going to get into it in this particular class. Okay, but as there's certain characteristics that do define a democracy, and voting being the most important one. And we call this political participation. And so our political participation defines our democracy and what we are able to do without fearing repercussion from the government. And repercussion just means that we're not going to get killed or thrown in jail. So the voting is the first one. And this characteristic defining a democracy says that we should have free, frequent, and fair elections, which means that nobody is coercing you to vote in a certain way. So free, frequent, and fair elections. As I said, decisions that are made at the national level by the government are made by our elected politicians. That's why it's kind of important that our votes are heard, that our votes are counted, that whoever we vote into office is going to do the best for the country. Hopefully that's going to happen. Another form of political participation is by discussing political issues, maybe with your family, with your friends, you're talking about what's going on in the country. It can take on many terms. And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the session when we talked about political socialization. How likely are you to discuss political issues that are going on? I think it's been happening more and more within the recent past. We can also write letters to our congressmen or to our senators, whether at the federal level or at the state level. It doesn't matter. If you feel strongly about a particular issue, if you would like for your elected official to do something for you or to consider something, you have every right to call them, to write them, to email them, to give them some kind of feedback or your feedback for that. Okay, other forms of political participation are contributing to campaigns for the different elected politicians. Let me give you an example of this one. When President Obama, or candidate Obama at that time, was running for re-election, or for election the first go-around, let's put it that way, the election the first go-around, the Democratic Party was not willing to fund him. They were not supportive of him because they said he had been in the Senate only for a year or so. He did not have name recognition. We'll talk about a lot of these things as we go through this particular section. But they said they were not. He was going to have to wait his turn, so they were not willing to contribute to his campaign. And so what he did is he went to social media, and he was able to amass quite a few of campaign contributions, like dollars, and even if they were small dollar figures, $5, $10, $20. So he ran very much a grassroots campaign. And so this is one way that you can do it. He's the one that kind of started this social media movement for campaign contributions. Otherwise, other ways that you can contribute, if you have a lot of money, you can go to these $5,000 a meal tickets, but I don't have that kind of money. I don't know about you. You can also join interest groups, and examples of an interest group. So I'll give you two examples. We're not going to do a section on interest groups, but for you to kind of understand what an interest group is, I'm going to give you the example of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And so people that are members of the National Rifle Association or the NRA don't want a lot of gun controls. And so that organization, that interest group will lobby the legislature, the Congress, especially at the congressional level, but also at the state level, for there not to be very strict laws against guns, gun control legislation. Another example of this might be like the Sierra Club. If you're into the environment and you want protection of the environment, etc., etc., that you join this one because you know that the Sierra Club is a large organization and they do have a lot of members, and they will try to push for different types of legislation to protect the environment. Now, between the NRA and the Sierra Club, I would say the NRA is definitely more powerful at this particular point in time. You can also join a protest movement. It's called the politics of protest, where you're saying, well, nobody wants to listen to us, so we're going to come out and we're going to say that we're not happy about a particular situation. We want something done about this. And the best example I can give you about the politics of protest was the Me Too movement. And if you don't know what the Me Too movement, this is saying, men cannot sexually harass women without there being consequences. And so, there was a lot of interest in it. It's kind of ebbed, as we go along, because that's just like the politics of protest. That's just the way it is. There's like cycles to it. I mean, there's a lot of urgency to it at the beginning, and then it starts to kind of wane. And so something else will come up. There's going to be a lot of urgency to it, then it starts to wane. But anyway, so people try to get things noticed, issues noticed, saying, pay attention to us. This is important to us. Okay, it's often been said that people do not vote because their vote does not count, but that is not true. That is not true. It is what is true that in the presidential elections, the general elections, which we will talk about later in another section, it is the Electoral College that votes in the president, and it should be based on our votes. I'm not saying that that's always the case. The popular vote in the last several elections that we've had, the person that got the largest number of popular votes was not elected president, because the electors, the Electoral College, the delegates to the Electoral College, they're the ones that voted these people in, or that they gave their votes, they pledged the votes to these people. So I'm saying I can understand why you think your vote might not count, and that would be the only instance where that may be a true statement. In all other elections, at the state level, even for the U.S. senators from Texas, for the congressman coming from your particular district, we're going to be talking about these things. The Texas representatives, the Texas Senate, we vote all of these people in, and your vote does count. Okay, so basically the elections are the ones that define the democracy. I'm telling you this because the elections are the most important part of our democracy. It is a mechanism for accountability. And what that says is that if somebody's not doing a good job, the best way to address that is to vote them out and vote somebody else in. It's a mechanism for accountability. And the paradox then, this participation paradox, is that people will vote for other reasons. So let's talk about some of the other reasons of who votes and why they vote, or why they think it's important to vote. All right, let's talk about who are the most likely people to vote. What are the demographics? Well, if you tend to have higher levels of education, and the studies define higher levels of education of having at least 2 years of college. If you're at least middle income, you're more likely to vote. And if you're older, and they define older as like 45 plus, you are more likely to vote. So those are the demographic variables of how we're saying, okay, this group is tending to vote this way, this group is tending to vote that way, because we're looking at the different demographic variables and the history of how they have tended to vote in the past. But there's a really important concept that kind of drives people out to vote, and this one is called political efficacy. And political efficacy basically says, I feel strongly that I can affect politics with my one vote. It is my right, it is my privilege to be able to go vote, and that's what I want to do. I want to have a say in the political process, the electoral process, I want to have a say in what's going on in the United States, so I'm going to go vote. Another variable that drives people out to vote are people that have strong party identification. And so strong party identification is basically saying I affiliate with one party, I affiliate with the other party, and I want that candidate to be elected. And so they use these variables to say who's in the base, who's the people that will vote in this particular candidate that will always vote him in, like the loyal people, the constituency, the base, that's what we call it. Who's the base for the Republican Party right now? Who's the base for the Democratic Party right now? And so in this particular instance, then the parties have to look for the swing votes. So they look for the differences. They say, what does race have to do with it? What does ethnicity have to do with it? You know, when we talked about political parties, I told you that the African American population tends to vote as a bloc for the Democratic Party, but that's not so true of the Hispanic vote. And so will either party try to bring in other people to increase their base so that they can get voted in. So that's what they're saying. Look for differences between race and income. Does it look like this particular race group or ethnic group is going to vote for a Republican or going to vote for a Democrat? Okay, so when it comes to voting here in Texas, there's not a lot of qualifications to vote. One, you have to be a U.S. citizen. I will say that again. You do have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be at least 18 years of age to vote, and you have to be a resident of the state or the county, the state of Texas and the county where you live. That you can claim that you are a resident of the state and the county, and you can register to vote. Okay, some people are excluded though, and the people that are excluded are those that have been declared mentally incompetent by a judge. We talked about this when we talked about the historical Texas, that people can't just be declared mentally incompetent by their relatives because they want to take their property or their money, that a judge has to say this person cannot fend for themselves, they cannot attend to their own affairs, to their own finances or whatever, somebody's going to be put in charge of them. So mentally incompetent. Okay, what about felons? And we'll talk about felonies later on when we talk about law in the courts, but basically these are people who have been in jail, who have been convicted of a felony and have been given jail time. And so what this one says is that uh, a felon's rights can be restored only if they are pardoned or if they complete or from 2 calendar years from the completion of their sentence. So an example of this would be, say a person commits a crime and they are given 10 years in prison. And so they serve 5 of those years and then they get the rest off for good behavior or whatever. But then they're put on parole, which is basically a supervised situation where they're saying you have to report to your parole officer so we know what you're doing. You have to get a job. You can't associate with your old cronies or whatever. So once that whole sentence is completed, 2 years from that point, then you can go ahead and ask for your voting rights to be restored. Okay, so people that actually do vote, let's talk about those. We call it voter turnout, and this is how it's defined: the proportion of eligible Americans who vote. The proportion of eligible Americans who vote. And so this has been declining for a long time. It's been declining since about the 1960s, but there's some reasons for that. And so it's been pretty constant since about 1996. I'm going to show you a graphic in a minute. And so the cohort that's the least likely to vote are the 18 to 24-year-olds. They're the least likely to vote because they have not really engaged in political life yet. They're saying the politicians do not really care about the issues that are important to us. So this age group is the one that's the least likely to vote. Okay, so this is the graphic I was mentioning. Okay, so from 1996 to 2016, in the United States, it's been, roughly around 50%. In Texas, it's been lower. We did have a few spikes there. We had a spike in 2004. We had a spike in 2008. And so if you look at the differences, but look at the ranking for the states, man, we're almost dead last, guys. We're almost dead last. We don't do a good job in going out to vote. So then the question is, well, how come, right? How come people don't come out to vote? What is it about Texas's past where people don't come out to vote? Okay, so there's been decline in voter turnout, and part of it is based on like the math part. The 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote, but I told you just a minute ago that age group is the one that's least likely to vote. So we have a smaller number of people voting over a larger population. So the nominator and the denominator. So when you do the math, it looks like it's a smaller population, but it's mainly because the 18 to 24-year-olds are not turning out to vote. There's been a decline in party identification. When we talked about political parties, I talked about the de-alignment and the realignment, where either you're switching parties, but more so the de-alignment, where they don't really want to claim either party. They're independents, they're swing voters, or they're just not going to. We're going to sit this one out, and that's been happening a lot in the past. There's also been a decline in political efficacy, and they're saying, well, why vote? My vote doesn't count. And that probably is happening more often than what you think. My vote doesn't count, so why even bother to go vote? Okay, let's talk about Texas and why Texas has had such a low voter turnout. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The book gives like a whole list of the reasons, but I'm just going to go over the ones that I think that are the most important. Okay, so these are called barriers to voting. Barriers to the low reasons don't the people that there's low voter turnout, and the barriers of how certain groups have been excluded in Texas in the past. And so there's a bunch of court cases. You don't have to remember the names of the court cases. What you do need to remember is that court cases. It took court cases to get rid of these barriers. So the first one that I want to talk about is the poll tax. And so the poll tax was basically a tax that you had to pay in order to be able to exercise your right as a citizen to vote. It's a payment of tax to vote. So this was from the 1920s, and it wasn't like a whole lot of money. It was like I think $3. But this was the 1920s. I mean, people couldn't afford like even $3. That was a lot of money at that time. So basically, poor people couldn't go vote, so excluded the poor. That was the first go round. So again, it took court cases to get rid of this particular barrier called the poll tax. Okay, the next barrier that I want to talk about is the white primary. We're going to be talking about the different types of elections later on in this lecture, but the function of the primary is to narrow down who's going to be running from either party. And so back in the in the early days of Texas, blacks were not allowed to vote in the primary elections. Only white people could vote. So basically, it was always going to be a candidate that was going to be of the best interest for Anglo voters. So excluded the blacks from voting in primary elections. And again, it took court cases to give blacks the right to vote in the primary elections. Okay, the next one is the military vote. Texas has a strong military presence. It's got a wide military presence. It was wider before, but because of all of the BRAC closures, they've closed a lot of bases. But Texas in the past has always had a lot of military bases. And so it used to be that people that were in the military would get stationed here in Texas, but they could not engage in political life here in Texas. If they wanted to vote, they had to use an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot. If you're deployed overseas, I can understand how you have to use an absentee ballot. But the thinking was this, the military are stationed here for 3 or 4 years. They come in, they buy houses, they buy cars, they go shopping, etc., etc. They engage in aspects of community life. They engage in aspects of economic life. They should be able to engage in aspects of political life. And that's another way of saying they should have a right to say who should be voted, who's going to be voted in the community where they live. So again, court cases to get rid of that. And they said, no, if you are stationed in Texas and you are in the military, you have full suffrage rights, and that just means full voting rights in Texas. Okay, the long residency requirement is different from what you would think of as a student, as for a student tuition or residency tuition for the students. When it comes to voting, what it used to be is that you had to live in Texas for a year before you were allowed to vote in Texas. And so again, it was the same thinking as the military. You come in, you get a job, you buy a house, you buy a car, you're engaged in community life, you're engaged in economic life. You should have every right to be able to also engage in political life and have a say in who's going to be voted in your particular area, in the state, and in your community. So again, court cases, and the Supreme Court actually had to step in on this one and say, no, Texas, you cannot do that. Stop it, Texas. Stop it. Stop it. Okay, now this one called property ownership, that's going to take like a little bit of explaining to do. Okay, first of all, property ownership is like you own a house, you own a farm, land, or whatever. So that's property. And so every property is assessed a valuation fee, and you pay taxes based on whatever your property is appraised at. Okay, so that's property ownership. That's that part. The bond elections are basically saying, okay, when the city wants to do something, like for example, the street construction, or all the streets that are being fixed in Corpus Christi, and it's been going on for a while, and it'll go on for a while longer. We, the people, had to vote in the ability for the city to borrow money to purchase the bonds to finance the road construction. So what this one is saying is that only people that own property could vote for these vote in these bond elections. Okay, so this was the fallacy, or the problem with that thinking. Property taxes does fund the city, but these bond elections are actually paid by sales taxes. It comes out of a sales tax. And they're saying even if people rent, if they don't own property and they're renting, they're still contributing in their rent. So I don't know any landlord that says, okay, I will rent you this property, but you don't have to pay the property taxes. That's on me. I'll pay them for you. That's not going to happen, guys. That's not going to happen. So you pay part of that property ownership thing when you pay your rent in the property tax format. Okay, when it comes to the bonds we voted in, as I said, that's financed separately. That's financed through sales tax. They'll increase it a little bit, and they'll increase it a little bit. So it's saying, okay, a series of court cases to get rid of this requirement as well. So they're saying, so now whenever these bond elections come out, and if you decide to vote, you get to vote in whether or not the city should borrow money to fix the streets, or fix a seawall, or fix different parts of the city that need to be fixed, and the city needs to borrow the money to be able to do that. Okay, so basically, we have had all of these historical barriers in the past, but those are now removed. But the state still has very low voting rates, very low voting rates. So I guess then the question is, well, why is it still so low, right? Why is it still so low?